Thank you very much, and thank you to you, Leo and Hannah, and all the other organisers for putting this session together. I think it's incredibly important, and I have to say, like you, I've very much enjoyed listening to the previous talks. So, as Victoria said, what I want to do is talk about the work we're doing specifically for the Royal Astronomical Society in the UK. I wouldn't want to pretend in that we're somehow, leading the field or anything like that. I think it's probably long overdue and something that's entirely necessary. But I will try to talk through some of the things we're doing, some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges that lie ahead. And the title, 200 Years In, refers to the fact that last year was our 200th anniversary, which was pretty much perfect timing for running a whole range of events associated with that. But never mind, that's another story. Right, let's see if I can, there we go. Advance my slides. Excellent. So, who are we? We are, pretty much the second largest professional astronomical society in the world. We have around 4,000 members in the UK and in the rest of the world, quite a lot of international membership. And as I mentioned, we were established 200 years ago. We are the oldest continuously existing astronomical society. There were some others that bubbled up and disappeared and reformed. And our central remit is to advance astronomy and also geophysics, because for historical reasons we include geophysicists. I think the thought at the time was of the Earth as a planet, so we encompass that too. And our current president is Professor Emma Bunce, who's a planetary scientist from Leicester, and her term of office continues for about another year. So, Emma, our director, myself and others regard this as a really important topic, and I'm only slightly embarrassed along with other people that we didn't get to it earlier. Like everybody else, I had that experience of going to Lyon. Ironically, I did the right thing. I took the Eurostar and I took the TGV down to Lyon, and then I realised I was entering this incredibly hot environment and a hotel room with no air conditioning. And if ever there was a stark measure of how extreme weather events can affect your life, it was that one. So, not in response to that, but in response to the general feeling that we had a special responsibility as a scientific organisation, we started to take this more seriously last year, setting up at last a sustainability working group. I know that the American Astronomical Society, for example, has done that a lot earlier, with the leadership of the RAS president chairing it. We feel that gives it the kind of due consideration it needs. And it's a small group. It includes interested people, some people who have expertise in this area, others who are researchers. We try to encompass the different disciplines just to get that different perspective. And also, obviously, practical people, things who understand how the problem can be solved. And our remit includes, as you would expect, our staff, but that's only 20 of us. We have a significant impact. There's only 20 of us. One of the arguments, of course, that's often made is tiny groups on their own don't make any difference, but that then is essentially like eschewing social responsibility more generally in my mind. We still have a responsibility. Our fellows, our members, clearly, a group we want to influence and change policies for, and then the wider astronomy and geophysics community, whether or not they're members, to some extent, whether or not they're in the UK as well, and that includes government and awarding bodies. So one of the first things we did was to assess how bad we were or how good we were, and we got in a private company to do that that specialises in this area, Electro, who I'd happily recommend. They were very good to work with, and they did a full audit of our systems. So they have followed the greenhouse gas protocol approach, which considers the stuff you emit yourselves through, say, your manufacturing process, very, very low in our case, as you'd imagine, the secondary emissions that arise from your kind of business activity, and then the stuff that leads on from that derives from your work. And we have things in all of those areas, but it's the latter two that are most important in our case. Let's see if I can advance the slide. Sorry about this. There we go. Right. So how did we do? Well, the answer is not brilliantly. At least if you're objectively looking in on us from wider society, we have a pretty high output. Perhaps not as bad as some of the other papers that you'll read in that issue of Nature Astronomy. So we don't have 37 tonnes or 18 tonnes per head for MPIA, but we do have 13.5 tonnes per employee, and that's more than twice the typical output for a UK citizen. So I don't think we should pretend that somehow we're doing, significantly better. Actually, we're considerably worse, and that's been reflected in other published papers. And the net zero target of 2 tonnes, the amount that you can sustainably emit and reclaim and so on, we're way, way off that. To be fair, our 13.5 tonnes per capita isn't necessarily all about the activity of staff, and I can't blame colleagues who are simply there doing things like managing our journals when actually they're not responsible directly for most of this emission, but it is certainly down to the work that we fund and foster. So, an awful lot of that comes from flights, not flights that in most cases staff are taking, but the things we support through travel grants. We are a small funder, but we're seen as a significant one, particularly by many early career scientists who see us as one of the ways they can get money to go to an international conference. And it's probably not surprising that many of those are long flights that you're talking about, people say, going to meetings in the United States where they don't have the resources from their institution to get there. Our building is old. We have perhaps not quite the same issues as the ones described in Potsdam, but they're not brilliant. We have a premises in central London in Burlington House. It's a grade 2-star listed building, which means it's difficult to modify. That's a conservation or heritage protection. And that generated nearly a quarter of our output. And then perhaps the biggest surprise for us was that 8% of our output came from distribution of a printed magazine. That actually, even printing a magazine and shipping it to some extent around the world is a fairly carbon intensive activity. That was something I don't think any of us suspect. Whereas things like, say the IT systems and that so on for us were really quite low. So there is a wider framework for this in the UK, similar to those around the world. And I think I would agree with, say, people like Deborah, that there are lots of wish fulfillment things here. So the UK government has a stated commitment to cut CO2 emissions by 4/5 from the 1990 level by 2035. It's enshrined in law in the Climate Change Act. And it sets carbon budgets for the UK, the whole of the UK, which are currently about 37% below what they were in 1990. And then it does it by sector as well. It makes suggestions to different sectors. What I think is noticeably absent from this, though, is that it doesn't really place legal obligations on different companies, different organisations to tackle this. And that, I think, is an enormous weakness in the legislation. It says, yes, as a nation we will do this, but it doesn't have that kind of teeth that it needs for particularly smaller businesses and so on to take this more seriously. So how have we been doing on this? Well, we've made a slow start, I think, but we're doing some stuff and we're kind of pushing on. Obviously, as you would expect, along with everybody else, our travel-related emissions collapsed last year. It's a completely ridiculous measure, but I'm going to include it because it shows what is possible, I guess. They fell by 87%, but that's entirely due to COVID. We made an early switch in our energy provider in our building, and that slashed 40% of our energy-related emissions, which was good and, again, overdue, and frankly, a quick and easy win. And then I think, in an effort to be more strategic, we signed something called the UN Climate Neutral Now Declaration, and I would actually encourage all astronomical organisations to consider doing this too. There are about 400 signatories, including a whole diverse range of businesses, even groups like primary schools and so on. And what that does is commit you as an organisation to following a path towards net zero. So, the not necessarily terribly ambitious target is half your emissions down by 2030 and net zero by 2050. But I would say, we could send a really strong message to the wider community if other organisations signed up to that. However, that's the easy stuff in my view. The harder choices are what we do and how we sell this and get the other wider community on board. For example, we may move to things like having our magazine online only. Now, I know this is a small niche thing, we're a small society, small number of distribution of copies and so on. But it's the sort of thing that may rub up against irritation from our wider membership. They may not be happy with that kind of change. At the very least, though, recipients outside the UK would benefit from that because sometimes the postal service is so slow in certain countries that they would actually read it in a more timely manner. And I hope now, after a year of working in this way, that we're getting more used to that. Our working arrangements in our building, have obviously changed radically. We're all still working at home. Only very slowly changed. Can we embed that in the future? Can we make that work? I think we probably can. But actually, it's only a fairly small contribution anyway. It turns out that because we're in central London, almost everybody commutes with public transport. So it's not a massive issue to shift to home working. We're not particularly bad on that already. And although it's beneficial because we tend to have fairly long commutes because people going into London do that, it's still, I think, a minor contribution, but probably a significant message to send. More difficult, I think, is that we will have to modify things like our grant system. We will say to people, we want to say to people, this isn't agreed yet, these are all early proposals, that, if you're going to apply for travel grants, for example, then you should be expected to use a low carbon solution for that. That should be the default. And if not, we would want to see, I think, a justification why that's not the case. Perhaps more radically, we should offer a carbon budget system too, where we say, in your application, you need to include that. If you can't meet that budget, are you going to pay for those UN supported gold standards offsets to address that? My view would be yes. Actually, I should mention that if we just spent 2,000 quid a year at the moment, we could offset all our emissions, and that would be, or 2,800, that would be a rather cheap way of doing it, but hardly, I think, any kind of long-term solution. But those sort of things need to be in there. And actually changing the nature of the way we work. We've got used to this idea that we fly in people for short talks in our building. And it's great, they come in, it's very exciting, they meet people, all of those things. But is it really justifiable to do that just for an hour's talk? And, if for nothing else, the last year has demonstrated how well alternative models can work. I mean, Deborah, I feel for you staying up all night, but at the same time, it's probably better than jet lag of coming to Europe to give your talk and then flying home again. And the thing we need to do, obviously, to monitor this is develop what are called KCPIs. In other words, we need key climate performance indicators where we're starting to monitor all this properly. So, I won't take too much from your time. My final slide here. What's next? Well, the obvious next thing, unfortunately, is that the temperature continues to rise, and that there is, that's going to happen anyway. It's up to us to mitigate that and attempt to control that rise. But let's face it, the initial damage has already been done. However, beyond our own organisational priorities, we have some influence politically. We get to meet ministers occasionally. We give evidence to MPs on committees in the House of Commons. We talk to peers in the House of Lords. We talk to MEPs, amazingly, still after Brexit, but we do still do that. And we can hopefully influence some of the funding agencies in the UK to be more radical on this as well. They all have warm words. They all talk about the importance of tackling the climate emergency. But in practice, what you find is that they give, they're largely grant awarding bodies. They give cash to recipients. Universities in the UK still then say you must travel by the cheapest route. I don't know of any exceptions to that where it's considered reasonable. I know there are exceptions in continental Europe, but not in the UK. So why not start to make that a condition of funding? Say to astronomers, you have a carbon budget associated with your grant. We expect you to meet that. We do not consider it acceptable that you take this money, and yes, we know it's an impingement on the amount of money you have for doing that research, and that's inconvenient. I think that is our conflict of interest, by the way. Actually, Deborah, that's the one thing where we do rub up against this, but that we have to do better. We have to say to people, it's not acceptable for you to use this funding to take multiple flights during a year. For example, let's think about the energy provision for your supercomputing facilities, and that would be, I think, a radical step that might start to move us forward in the right direction. So we have started those conversations with the STFC, the Science and Technology Facilities Council, and the UK Space Agency in the UK, and I hope that they will continue. I hope that we start to move them to a point where they can mandate these things and really shift things, rather than just playing lip service, which I think is pretty much what we've done up to now. We have that unfortunate thing of being a very privileged group of people who understand the climate science, completely accept it, and yet actually our own personal behaviour has been incredibly slow to change. So I would just leave you with the thought that we're only a small organisation. We think we're an influential one. We want to shift these things. But I think the challenge for us will be reaching out beyond groups like this, actually saying to people, you're going to have to make some significant changes to your personal behaviour in this, but you can still do research. You can still collaborate with international partners. You can even go and meet them now and again. Just let's move away from the assumption that multiple flights a year, high energy activities are essential for a successful research career. And let's think about doing things differently. So with that, I will leave you, and I will happily at the end of the session take questions, and I'll switch on Slack again and answer them while in the last bit too. Thank you.